Okay, weekend waffle time. So what I want to get into this week is the topic of import games and how this has gone something from being quite exciting and unobtainable to something which seems to have fizzled out in recent years. And really my own experience of import games started with the Mega Drive, because a friend of mine wanted to borrow my Game Genie, and I said, is it because you want to use it for cheats? He says, no, I want to use it as a pass-through. And I didn't get what he meant. And he had a game called Hellfire, which is quite a well-known shoot-'em-up on the Mega Drive. And I thought at that point it was a Japanese-only game, and I think he was under the impression as well. And the difference with the cartridges is this is Strider, so you've got a European, an American cartridge, and a Japanese one. But the difference is, if you put them together, the Japanese one is slightly differently shaped to the European one. And what this means is, if you take a European cartridge, you can put it in a Japanese console. If you take a Japanese cartridge, you can't put it in the European console, which is a bit of a problem. So the way you get around it is using one of these, which is just a pass-through, but the Game Genie did the same thing, and you just put that into your Mega Drive. And that was really my first experience. And games at that time in the 90s would quite often come out in Japan and even the States before they came out in Europe. And magazines would review games, and if you've watched the previous video that I did on retro magazines, some of these previews and even reviews came out a year before the game hit the UK shelves. So there was a big demand for import games, and if you certainly look at the magazines at the time, you'll see that there are adverts for imports. Of course they cost a lot more, but if you really wanted Street Fighter 2 on the Mega Drive a year before it came out in the UK, then that's what you did. And really this was something that I didn't really bother with too much with the Mega Drive. I was aware of a friend of mine having Hellfire and it being almost a special thing because of that. The only import that I had was Alien 3 on the Mega Drive, and it was the Genesis version, and it wasn't for the sake of it coming out earlier, it was just that I bought it from an independent shop and got it home and I noticed it said Genesis on it. Other than that, it played perfectly fine. But the Saturn games, where things really got more exciting and more interesting for me, because the Saturn, I think you can look back at it now and perhaps it has a bad reputation. If you look at the 3D games on the PlayStation and the Saturn games don't look as good for the most part. And the reason for that is that the Saturn has a multiprocessor architecture, so you've got two SH2 CPUs and then the two VDP processors and then the sound chip. So you've got 4 processors for doing the game and the graphics, which now isn't such a problem with multi-core, but then in the early mid-90s was quite a problem to program for. Whereas the PlayStation had I've had to write this down, R3000 processor in it. I have no idea what the architecture is, but it's a 32-bit CPU, and it had a graphics chip on the same die as the CPU, which meant that the architecture was much simpler to program for, which meant that games 3D wise were often a lot better on the PlayStation, and particularly ports were often better. With the game that comes to mind is Die Hard Trilogy, which had a terrible frame rate on the Saturn, but the PlayStation version was really good. And the real reason for this was that the Saturn was meant to be a 2D machine. So going back to the previous videos on Steve Benway's Gale Racer and the video that I did on Galaxy Force 2, this is what the Saturn was designed for, throwing around lots and lots of sprites at high speeds. And when the PlayStation was announced, Sega decided to add this 3D capability to it by adding on a few more processors. And what this meant was that the Saturn almost had a split personality. Part of it was that it was a 3D machine, and as I've just said, it didn't have a great reputation for that. But it also had the capability of doing these really nice 2D games, and they were often a lot better than the PlayStation. And part of this was to do with the RAM, whereas the Saturn has 2 megabytes of RAM, and the PlayStation, if I remember correctly, has just the 1 megabyte. But the main problem with 2D games is, with a cartridge you can just address as much memory as on the cartridge, but with the Saturn you have to, and the PlayStation, you have to load it into RAM, so you've only got 2 megabytes. And these games didn't sell very well at the start. I think people wanted 3D games, but over time a lot of the Capcom games, like the Street Fighter Alpha series and even the Street Fighter vs Marvel series, or Street Fighter vs X-Men to start with, started to get some attention. And going back to the imports, we would see in the official Sega magazine, or the official Sega Saturn magazine, the articles would be talking about imports, which is a bit bizarre because Sega, from an official position, I don't think they want you playing imports, they want you playing domestic games. So I think the Saturn got to such a point that the magazine editors realised that the end was coming for the UK market. It was starting to dry up. The PlayStation and the N64 were just, you know, walking all over the Saturn market. But there was this new hope coming from Japan, and these were this renaissance of 2D games coming back in for the console, which is what the thing was designed for in the first place. And I'd say really the big innovation of this was the RAM cart. So with the Saturn, you've also got this, which is a cartridge slot. So you've got cartridge and put it the right way. It slots in like that. And there are various ones such as, you know, backup, or like backup RAM or import cartridge, things like that. But take a breather. But the main advantage of this was that there was a cartridge that came out on the King of Fighters 95 game, which did receive a UK release, and the cartridge allowed you to add an additional, I think it was 1 megabyte to the console. And what that meant was that all the backgrounds could be loaded on the cartridge and in ROM, and the rest of the game would load off the disc. And this seemed to take off, and particularly in Japan it took off really well, whereas RAM carts started coming out, and these were initially 1 megabyte and they went up to 4 megabytes, giving you 6 megabyte in total, which was quite respectable for the time. And the 2D arcade games started to get Saturn releases, but at the same time that this happened, the UK market was drying up. So the magazines were talking about these games and saying, look, add a 60Hz switch to your machine, add a country converter and import these games. And I think that was just a real shame that it came so late, because we had such almost arcade perfect games like your Samurai Showdown, or Samurai Spirits as it was in Japan, and your Fatal Fury games, King of Fighters, Metal Slug, the Capcom games like Street Fighter vs X-Men and Marvel Superheroes, and even Marvel, which one was it? Marvel vs Capcom, the first one came out on the Saturn, and even Street Fighter Alpha 3 did, which is considered to be better than the Dreamcast version. And all these were enabled because of the RAM cartridge, and we didn't get them in the UK. Fortunately, there was a cartridge which has been released, and I've recently just ordered one of these, and it was just a case of seeing the cost of them, because the problem was in the UK you could have a cartridge that would allow you to run imports, but you couldn't use the RAM cart at the same time. There were some techniques for swapping them out, but that could damage the console, supposedly. But there was an Action Replay that came out that supported this 1 megabyte stroke 4 megabyte switch. It had some backup RAM so you could save your games, and it did the import, but they were incredibly expensive at the time. And really my experience there was that I saw these, and these were in 1999, 2000, and they were a bit expensive. Importing games was expensive at the time, and I was on the fence about going for these games. I'd really enjoyed Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Saturn. I thought, I want to play these games, but they were so expensive at the time, and to import, I mean, even from eBay they were expensive. I think it had just come around, and I started to look at the Dreamcast, and the game that really made me think about the Dreamcast was Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and later 2, but there was also Street Fighter Alpha 3, and I looked at the cost of it and I thought, well, I could modify or send the console off, get it modified to 60 Hz and get an import cartridge and do all this and spend a lot of money on the games, and I thought, or I could just buy a Dreamcast. And that's what I did. I bought it and then bought a lot of the beat-em-ups on that machine, and I forgot about the Saturn for a long time. And I think seeing, particularly Retro Replay well, this year, earlier on, I was able to play on some of these import games for the Saturn, these beat-em-ups, and I'd play them on the Neo Geo and the Neo Geo CD, and I'd play the Saturn versions, and I thought, actually, these are really good. I'd not played any of the RAM-assisted games, and these were really good. They were very playable, and I think this made me think, well, how much are these imported cartridges? And I've you know, the 25 quid, which is what you pay for a mid-price game at the moment. And I had a look on eBay, and the import games are actually quite cheap. You can get a lot of these titles which would cost, you know, in the past 50, 60, 70 quid. Now they're selling them for less than a tenner or a fiver, and I thought, this seems to be quite a good time to get back into the Saturn. And I think the Saturn really did receive a lot of games that came out in Japan that were perhaps commercially unviable in the West, and I think this was a real shame. And I think if these had come out earlier, or maybe the Saturn had have come out earlier, maybe it would have done a lot better, but what can you do? I think now, looking back, it's a really nice machine to pick up, particularly if you like 2D beat-em-ups or these 2D games. It's far, far better than the PlayStation for that. Just, I mean, if you look at Street Fighter Alpha 3 for an example, there's no comparison because of the memory difference. There's just this much more animation. So really, coming back to this, just to a point, the import scene seems to have dried up. I think with the Dreamcast, this was really the end of the era for it, because the Dreamcast was the first Sega machine that didn't have a cartridge, and it was really the cartridges that allowed this import ability, because you get these unofficial ones. And the Dreamcast had the ability to boot an Action Replay cartridge, not a disc rather. And there were some good imports. The previous game that I've looked at, which was Frame Gride, there were some good titles on the Dreamcast at the start that didn't come out in the West, although fortunately most of the 2D beat-em-ups did, which is, you know, a good thing. But the Dreamcast seemed to die off, and in Europe probably 2002, and there were some Japanese imports towards the end, but I think that really marked the end of it. I think the Dreamcast was the last console that we really got excited about with imports, and I think with the Xbox and 360 and PS3, I'm sure there probably are some good import games, but I don't really hear about them very much, and I think it's really just maybe it's an effect of the way the market runs now, that Japanese companies are not wanting to take the risk, because a lot of these conversions, or games like the Saturn games like Cotton and Cotton 2, and even the games like Outrun, they might not have, or even Chase HQ, they might not have sold very well in the West. I think there would have been people that would have enjoyed them, certainly me. I'm a big fan of Chase HQ, but I don't know how well that would have sold. Whereas Outrun and Space Harrier and, well no, Space Harrier did come out on one of the collection discs in Europe, but I don't think they would have sold very well. And I think it was just I think it was just bad luck on Sega's part. I think the 32X had come out and hadn't really pushed 2D as far as it could have done, and I think Sega just wanted to make a clean break and go to 3D, which is a bit of a shame. So yeah, I think now with games costing so much to make, I think companies now want these worldwide releases. They don't want to just constrain them to their own territories, which is good because you get these strange little games that perhaps wouldn't have come out otherwise, and this is a good example of having downloadable content. But there's something nice about having a Japanese game compared to the European one. I'll just end it on this. You take Strider as an example. This is the European box art, and this is the Japanese box art, and the Japanese one just looks so much cooler, and even on the end it looks good. And the manuals in Europe on the Mega Drive were black and white affairs, whereas with this you've got these nice colour manuals. So just as an example, or the warning instructions. The European ones are a bit boring, and I'm sure the US ones are the same, but these have got all these fancy bits of artwork, and they're cartoony and they're just fun. I mean, there's just something about the Japanese style. And the other game that I previously looked at was Mars Matrix, which I got fairly cheap, but it's just something about the box art that just seems so much more appealing. And I think playing a game that you're not supposed to play has its appeal in some ways, and I think it's a real shame that we've lost this. I think having import games was something quite special, and I think it provided a lot of enjoyment to people who really got into it, and really it was, I suppose, making a statement to say there are games that you want to play not because they're popular in the UK or they're readily available. It's you went out of your way because there's a game that you wanted to play, and you would import it and you do whatever you needed to play that game. And I think that was a good thing. And I think that's a shame that we've lost it, but we've got downloadable content. So yeah, I think that's all I've got to say on that for the moment. I'm sure there'll be people that have got different stories and lots of things they can add to this, so please comment below if you've got any suggestions or any war stories you'd like to share. So thank you very much for watching.